A small metal bowl was placed in front of the prisoners, filled with something cold, white, and slowly melting. And when one man touched it, he pulled his hand back in confusion, because no one served frozen sweets in the middle of a war, and several prisoners quietly wondered if this strange food was truly meant for them or for someone else. The camp where these men were held sat far from any large city, surrounded by open land and long wooden fences that marked a boundary more psychological than physical. Because by this stage of the war, many German prisoners in the United States already understood that escape across unfamiliar territory, foreign language, and vast distances was rarely successful. So daily life settled into a predictable rhythm of roll calls, work assignments, and meals that were plain but sufficient and within. This routine, the smallest deviation drew attention, which is why the afternoon when the kitchen staff announced a special dessert became memorable long before anyone even saw what it was, since dessert itself was not a daily expectation for men who had spent years associating food with rationing, substitution ingredients, and the constant awareness that supplies in Europe were shrinking as the war dragged on. On that particular day, the weather was warmer than usual, with dry air and a bright sky that made the barracks feel stuffy by mid-afternoon. And after returning from work details that included farm labor, maintenance, and warehouse sorting, the prisoners lined up with their metal trays, expecting the usual combination of bread, soup, and some form of protein. But instead, they noticed the American kitchen workers moving carefully around large, insulated containers that released faint wisps of cold vapor when opened, a sight that several prisoners observed with quiet curiosity because cold storage on that scale was rare in their recent memories. And rumors moved down the line in low voices as men speculated whether meat or dairy had arrived, or whether it was simply a method to preserve something ordinary. When the first servings were placed on trays, the confusion grew rather than cleared, because each man received a small portion of a pale frozen substance that held its shape but softened at the edges, and the guards offered no explanation beyond simple gestures to keep the line moving, which left the prisoners studying the unfamiliar item as they carried their trays to the wooden tables where conversations usually revolved around letters from home, news fragments, or speculation about the war's progress. Yet now the focus narrowed entirely onto this strange addition that looked too delicate to be a staple and too carefully prepared to be accidental. Several of the older prisoners examined it with practical suspicion, using their spoons to test the texture while recalling how in difficult periods people improvised foods from potatoes, powdered milk, or ersatz ingredients. And a few wondered whether this might be a nutritional supplement disguised as a treat, since military systems sometimes introduced new foods without explanation, while younger prisoners, especially those who had worked in hospitality or food trades before the war, noticed the smoothness and faint sweetness on the spoon and began to suspect it was a frozen dessert similar to items known in certain European cities but rarely accessible during wartime scarcity, which created a quiet divide between those who approached it cautiously and those who were willing to taste first and judge later. The first reactions were subtle rather than dramatic, because discipline and social awareness in the camp meant men rarely displayed strong emotion in public spaces, yet expressions softened as the cold sweetness contrasted sharply with the hearty but repetitive meals they were accustomed to. And what struck many of them most was not the flavor itself, but the idea that such a non-essential food could be prepared, transported, and served regularly in a country at war, since in their experience, luxuries disappeared quickly once conflict intensified, and here they were encountering something that felt like a peacetime indulgence. Conversations slowly expanded from whispers into thoughtful discussion about how food culture differ between nations, with some prisoners recalling cafes and seasonal treats from pre-war Germany, while acknowledging that frozen desserts had been occasional pleasures rather than common fare, and others reflecting on how American agriculture, refrigeration, and distribution systems seemed to support a different relationship with food abundance, which led to a broader realization that captivity in the United States exposed them not only to new routines, but also to everyday civilian habits that contrasted with the austerity many associated with wartime Europe. And as bowls gradually emptied and the melting dessert turned into a sweet liquid at the bottom of the metal dishes, the moment settled into memory as one of those small cultural encounters that quietly reshaped expectations without any speeches or formal explanations. After that first afternoon, the appearance of frozen dessert did not become a daily occurrence. Yet it did not remain a one-time mystery either, because the prisoners would encounter it again on certain warm days, usually after longer work periods or during weekends when the schedule inside the camp felt slightly less rigid. And this repetition allowed them to observe patterns rather than treat the experience as an isolated surprise, since men living in confinement often learn to read meaning. From routine, noticing what returned, what disappeared, and what arrived only under specific conditions. They began to see that the dessert was connected to temperature and timing, because it appeared mostly in warmer weather and was served quickly after being brought from insulated containers, which suggested that it required careful handling, and this alone revealed something about American food storage methods, since keeping anything frozen in large quantity demanded ice production, refrigeration equipment, or reliable delivery systems, and several prisoners recognized that such systems required electricity, fuel, and maintenance that might be difficult to sustain in areas directly affected by war, which led them to quietly conclude that the American home front operated under different pressures than the cities and towns many of them had left behind. Some prisoners assigned to kitchen or nearby work details occasionally glimpsed how these desserts arrived, noticing boxes packed with ice or containers designed to slow melting. And although they were not given technical explanations, simple observation showed that the process was organized rather than improvised, and organization usually reflects established supply chains rather than temporary generosity, which helped the men frame the dessert as part of normal provisioning rather than a special favor. At the tables, discussions became more practical and less suspicious, because once a food proves safe and understandable, curiosity turns into comparison, and the men compared it to pre-war memories of cafes, fairs, and summer outings where similar treats might appear, though rarely during difficult times, and these memories carried a quiet sense of contrast rather than longing, since captivity encouraged emotional restraint. Yet they still provided reference points that helped the prisoners categorize what they were experiencing. Younger prisoners often adapted faster, treating the dessert simply as another part of the meal when it appeared, while older men sometimes viewed it as a reminder of how differently societies manage comfort during hardship. And this difference in perspective reflected age and background more than attitude, because people interpret the same event through the lens of their past experiences, especially in unfamiliar environments. The guards maintained their usual, neutral manner, distributing the portions without comment and moving on to the next task. And this lack of emphasis signaled that the dessert was not meant to send a message or create goodwill, but simply fit within the camp's food planning. And when something is handled without ceremony, it often indicates routine rather than symbolism. Over time, the prisoners also noticed that these desserts were small in portion and never replaced regular food, which showed that they were additions rather than substitutes. And this practical balance aligned with institutional logic, since meals still needed to meet nutritional needs first, and extras could only appear when supply allowed. What gradually replaced confusion was a broader awareness that American food systems combined preservation, refrigeration, and agriculture in ways that supported occasional comforts even during wartime. And this awareness did not change the prisoner's situation, yet it added nuance to how they viewed the country around them, since daily life revealed information that official statements never did. By the end of this period, the frozen dessert no longer felt like a puzzle, but like a seasonal feature of camp life, something that appeared, was accepted, and passed without drama. And this shift from surprise to familiarity illustrated how adaptation works in small steps, where repeated exposure turns unusual experiences into understood routine, adding another quiet layer to the prisoner's evolving picture of life far from home. As the prisoners encountered these frozen desserts on several occasions, their attention gradually shifted from the novelty of taste to the practical question of how such a thing was even possible in a wartime setting. Because men who had lived through shortages tend to think in terms of supply, transport, and storage rather than indulgence. And the simple fact that something could remain frozen long enough to be served to hundreds of men suggested a chain of preparation that extended well beyond the camp kitchen, involving ice production, insulated transport, and careful timing, and each of these steps required resources that many of them associated with stable civilian infrastructure rather than military necessity. Some prisoners with technical or mechanical backgrounds speculated quietly about refrigeration systems, recalling pre-war factories or rail cars equipped with cooling compartments, and they understood that keeping food frozen was not magic but engineering, which made the dessert less mysterious and more a sign of industrial capacity. And this interpretation fit the broader pattern they were observing in American camps, where organization and logistics shaped daily life in visible but understated ways. At the tables, the dessert also created small social moments, since men compared how quickly it melted, how sweet it tasted, and whether it resembled treats they remembered from before the war. And these comparisons stayed grounded and factual, because emotional reactions were often kept private in captivity. Yet the act of sharing impressions still broke the monotony of repetitive meals. And even minor variation in routine can make a day feel distinct when most days follow similar patterns. Several prisoners noticed that the dessert encouraged slower eating, since melting required attention. And this slowed pace subtly changed the atmosphere at the tables, making conversations stretch a little longer, and longer conversations sometimes drifted toward neutral memories of civilian life, such as summers, markets, or family gatherings, though these recollections were usually brief and matter-of-fact rather than sentimental, because dwelling too much on the past could make confinement feel heavier. The presence of frozen sweets also reinforced an idea that had been forming in their minds, which was that the American home front, distant from direct destruction, maintained systems that supported civilian-style consumption alongside wartime production, and seeing this firsthand provided a clearer impression than rumors ever could, since direct observation carries more weight than secondhand stories. Guards and kitchen workers continued their routine distribution without commentary, and this neutrality reminded the prisoners that the dessert was not meant as a signal or reward, but simply part of provisioning when conditions allowed. And understanding this helped them keep balanced expectations, since reading special meaning into ordinary logistics could lead to false conclusions. Over time, the dessert stopped being the main topic and became just another recognizable feature that appeared occasionally. And when something becomes recognizable, it takes its place within routine rather than outside it, which is how the mind maintains stability in a controlled environment. For many of the men, what remained notable was not the sweetness, but the contrast with their recent experiences in Europe, where such items would have been rare or saved for special circumstances. And this contrast quietly illustrated how different wartime realities could exist at the same time in different places. By this stage, the frozen dessert had completed its transition from curiosity to understood detail, showing once again how repeated exposure turns unfamiliar experiences into accepted parts of daily life, and how even small moments at a meal can reveal the larger systems operating beyond what the eye can see, giving the prisoners another practical insight into the world surrounding their confinement. As the months moved forward and the camp routine settled into long stretches of predictable days, the occasional appearance of frozen dessert no longer interrupted the rhythm of meals, yet it remained one of those details that quietly illustrated how the environment around the prisoners functioned, because by now the men understood that such food did not arrive by accident, and anything that required cold storage, timing, and coordination reflected planning beyond the visible kitchen. And prisoners who paid attention to these patterns often build a mental picture of the larger system that supported daily life, since captivity sharpened observation as a way to understand one's surroundings. They noticed that these desserts appeared most often after supply deliveries or during periods of warmer weather, which suggested practical reasoning rather than generosity. And practical reasoning made sense in an institutional setting, because kitchens managing many people rely on scheduling and availability rather than impulse. And this realization helped the prisoners interpret the dessert as part of logistical flow instead of symbolic treatment, which kept their expectations grounded and realistic. Some men assigned to outdoor work details occasionally saw delivery trucks arriving with mixed supplies, including crates packed in ways that hinted at temperature control, and while they could not inspect contents closely, they recognized the signs of organized distribution, and organized distribution usually indicates stable infrastructure, since irregular systems rarely maintain consistent results. And this stability contrasted with the fragmented supply networks many had witnessed in Europe during the later war years. At the tables, the dessert gradually became a neutral addition, something noted but not discussed at length. And this neutrality showed that adaptation had taken place, because once people understand how and why something appears, it stops feeling unusual, and unusual things only remain topics of conversation while they are unexplained. The guards continued their professional routine, serving portions without change in tone or behavior. And this steady manner reinforced that the dessert held no special meaning beyond nutrition and planning. And prisoners who had spent time in structured environments understood that institutions favor consistency because it reduces tension and confusion among large groups. For the prisoners, the frozen sweet never represented comfort and never altered their status, yet did add slight variation to meals that otherwise followed repetition. And small variation can make time feel more segmented, which helps people measure long periods of confinement without relying solely on calendars. Some prisoners reflected privately that the contrast between expectation and reality was what made the experience memorable, since many had assumed that war narrowed daily life to essentials only, and encountering occasional non-essential foods challenged that assumption, not by creating optimism, but by expanding their understanding of how different regions experience the same war differently. By this point, the dessert had fully entered the category of known routine, appearing, being consumed, and passing without speculation. And this quiet normalization demonstrated how human perception adjusts through repeated exposure, turning unfamiliar experiences into ordinary facts. In this steady progression, the frozen desserts served as a small but clear example of how infrastructure, agriculture, and storage systems shape everyday life. And for prisoners observing carefully, these small details provided insight into the broader society around them, showing that even during global conflict, daily routines could still reflect local capacity and organization beyond the visible fences. As time continued and the camp routine stretched across seasons, the occasional serving of frozen dessert settled fully into the background of daily life. And for many prisoners, it became less a subject of attention and more a quiet reference point in how they understood the country around them. Because by now they had seen enough patterns to recognize that such foods depended on agriculture, industry, and transport working together. And when these systems function smoothly, even perishable items can appear far from where they are produced, which was a practical lesson drawn not from explanation, but from repeated observation at the table. Several prisoners who had worked in trades before the war thought about how many steps were required before a single portion reached their tray, since dairy farming, sugar production, processing, freezing, and delivery all had to align in timing, and each step relied on equipment, fuel, and labor that remained available despite wartime demands. And this chain of effort highlighted how domestic systems can continue operating even when a nation is involved in global conflict, provided that production and distribution remain organized. They also understood that frozen desserts could not be stored indefinitely the way canned goods could, which meant they were prepared and delivered within shorter windows. And this time sensitivity implied planning rather than surplus disposal, because institutions rarely risk waste on large scale, and risk management is a priority wherever supplies must cover many people. At the tables, reactions became minimal and practical, with men finishing their portions without examining them closely, and this behavior showed that the novelty had passed completely, since people rarely analyze what feels familiar, and familiarity often brings mental efficiency, which matters in environments where conserving emotional energy helps maintain balance. Some prisoners later recalled that what stood out most was not the sweetness itself, but the contrast with memories of scarcity, because contrast shapes memory more strongly than repetition. And encountering something once considered a luxury during a time of war created a quiet awareness that conditions varied greatly depending on location. The guards and staff maintained their steady, neutral service, and this consistency reinforced that meals followed regulation rather than mood, and regulated systems, while restrictive, often feel more stable than unpredictable ones, since predictability allows people to anticipate routine even within limits. For the prisoners, the dessert never softened the reality of confinement and never altered the structure of camp life, yet contributed to the rhythm that divided days into recognizable segments, and recognizable segments helped the mind measure time during long periods of restriction. By this stage, the frozen treat had become just another part of how meals sometimes unfolded, appearing without announcement and disappearing without discussion. And this quiet presence illustrated how adaptation works through repetition, turning unfamiliar details into accepted routine. In this way, a simple frozen dessert became a small window into how food systems, technology, and organization supported daily life in one part of the world during wartime, and for men paying attention to the details around them. Even a modest item on a tray could reveal how larger systems function beyond what they could directly see, offering insight gathered from ordinary moments rather than extraordinary events. In the end, the frozen dessert did not change their situation, did not shorten their captivity, and did not carry any hidden promise. Yet it remained one of those small details where expectation met a different reality, because many of the prisoners associated wartime with strict limitation and the disappearance of non-essential comforts. And encountering something sweet and carefully preserved during a global conflict quietly challenged that assumption, showing them that daily life in another country could operate under different conditions, even while the same war continued elsewhere. What began as confusion slowly turned into practical understanding, as repeated appearances showed that the dessert was not a special gesture, but part of a structured food system shaped by local agriculture, refrigeration, and organized delivery. And this shift from suspicion to acceptance illustrates how people adapt by observing patterns and forming logical explanations. Since logical explanations help maintain mental balance in unfamiliar environments. For the prisoners, the lesson was not about enjoying a treat, but about recognizing that ordinary habits often reflect infrastructure and resources more than intention. And seeing this firsthand gave them a clearer, more grounded picture of the society around them, built from daily observation rather than official information. Over time, the desert blended into the background of camp life. Yet the memory of their first reaction sometimes remained, because first encounters with difference tend to anchor memory, especially when they involve food, which connects strongly to personal experience and routine. Many visible traces of POW life faded after the war, but memories of small daily moments lasted longer. And details like these helped former prisoners describe captivity not only through rules and fences, but through quiet contrasts that revealed how different worlds functioned at the same time. And so the story of a simple frozen sweet settles as a modest example of how adaptation works, showing that even in confinement, people continue to observe, compare, and learn, and that history is often experienced through ordinary daily encounters as much as through major events, with a small dessert quietly illustrating how different realities can meet across a table during a time of war. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.